When is willful interference to another amateur radio station permitted? So when are you allowed to purposely interfere with somebody else? At no time, never. Yeah, so the question is, what is considered indecent or obscene? Is there a list? And the answer is no. There's no list. It's one of those things where I've heard people using cuss words on the radio. It's completely inappropriate. If nobody turns you in, then nobody, then nothing's ever going to be done about it. If somebody turns you in, then the FCC will determine at their will to do that. I mean, so the question was, if you're transmitting something that may be offensive to somebody, can you get in trouble? And the answer is yes, you could. I mean, if somebody turns you in, now you'll have an opportunity to defend that, but I mean, it's no different than anything else anymore. It really isn't any different. What's considered obscene and what's acceptable is kind of relative to the person evaluating it at that time. But odds are, even if somebody turns you into the FCC for that one time, they probably aren't going to waste their time even looking into it, because it happens. The FCC probably isn't recording any conversation. It would be, yep. What is the meaning of the term broadcasting in the FCC rules for the amateur radio service? Broadcasting means transmissions intended for reception by the general public. You are not allowed to broadcast on amateur radio. So the intention is that you would have two-way or one-to-many communications, but it's not for the general public. You couldn't just get on there and then just start having your own morning disc jockey radio show, Good morning, Milford. The weather is this and that, and it's going to be a gloomy day, but, and you just on and on and on and on. And the only purpose of that communication is clearly for just people to tune in and listen. It's not communications. That's broadcasting. That's not allowed on amateur radio. Yep. Yeah, it's all about personal communications.
So Resistance Chicks is not going to broadcast our monologue of daily events on your radio.
That would be a broadcast.
Right.
Yep. But you can absolutely get on there. And I mean, this stuff happens. There are quite a few, especially on the HF frequencies, people who will get on there and start preaching. And it's pretty clear it's not allowed. It's also pretty clear that no one's doing much about it. So generally, don't worry about running afoul of the law. If you're not trying to do something wrong, odds are you're going to be completely fine. It's not so heavily regulated that, one mistake and you're out and you're facing a huge fine. It's not like that. And the FCC, when they do go after people, are looking for repeatable, events, and they're going to see a pattern of abuse. Yeah.
So now I remember, family radio was I would hear them a lot when I built that shortwave radio converted back in the 70s. But they would have broadcasts that came on various other ones, which Voice of America. So they're on different frequencies.
Yeah, they're not ham radio stations. Yeah, there are a lot of international broadcasts. Absolutely. That's why these rules exist, because the FCC has said there are frequencies to do these activities, not these. If you want to do them, go buy a license. They'll gladly sell one to you. These are free licenses, which means you don't get to do anything you want. It's for your personal use. Yeah. Yeah, and there is, so a lot of rules go out the window whenever there's an emergency. And so, but it is really important though, that it's not just because there's an emergency, your communication has to save like life and limb. Like you might get on there and broadcast with the intention of anybody hearing it, like there's a tornado and it's coming down this road and this, that. You're not talking to any specific person. You're literally broadcasting the general public. That communication is relevant because there's an emergency happening at this moment and anyone hearing it can take cover. But to say, if I was, just outside Kenosha, Wisconsin, while the riots were happening, and I start broadcasting about what's happening there and giving a step-by-step, and here's, and I'm getting fed information from somebody, that's news reporting, and that's what the local news station's for, not your ham radio.
You know what weather reporting is a broadcast.
Yes, because it's intended for general reception. Yep.
I'm sitting there at home and I see a tornado coming my direction. I can be like, I'm at this location.
Yeah, you could. Odds are you probably won't because very few people are going to hear you. I mean, the effectiveness of that communication. I mean, there might be 30 ham radio operators on this repeater at any given time, but who knows where they are? They're in the area, but not necessarily right where you are. And odds are the general public isn't really listening anyways. So the effectiveness of broadcasting out like that isn't very effective. So probably won't do it.
Let's just say, and you know who's around you. Like, okay. Since I was at young lady there in Pittsburgh, and there were tornadoes coming. I went right straight to the truck, which is my town. And I was like, would sure be nice to know where these things are touching down, and I was listening to the radio. But so if hammers knew something was coming through, would other hammers be more likely to get on board to listening?
Probably. And in fact, a lot of times, amateur radio operators have what they call Skywarn, and those are people who have specific training on how to identify tornadoes. So as the funnel clouds are forming, and when you go through that certification, you can actually be one that reports it in as official. Because if you just report a tornado, it's not considered official until someone who's certified has seen it, because people see all kinds of things. And so there are Skywarn nets that will become activated, and you'll get a lot of ham radio operators that will go there to report in and hear information. And so you will see that. Is the general public tuning in? Usually not, but also you could have amateur radio related news and information and be broadcasting that out. And I say broadcasting out because I'm saying it's in one way, but that doesn't make the definition of broadcast. Broadcast is intended for reception by the general public. If my intended reception is other ham radio operators, that's not the general public, that's other ham radio operators. Under which of the following circumstances may an amateur station make a one-way transmission? The answer is when transmitting code practice. That's Morse code. So if I'm doing code practice, I'd say, hey, everybody, come on this frequency at night at this time, and I'm going to send out Morse code. And the purpose is for you to learn Morse code. You're going to receive it and sharpen your skills. That's one way. I'm just sending it out. It's one-way transmission. It's not a broadcast. Why isn't that a broadcast? Because it's for ham radio operators, not the public. Could the public listen? Yes. But who's the intended recipient? Ham radio. Information bulletins. Again, a ham radio related information bulletin for ham radio operators, or transmissions necessary to provide emergency communications. That's the one exception. Under which of the following circumstances are amateur stations authorized to transmit signals related to broadcasting, program production, or news gathering, assuming no other means are available? And the answer is only when the communications directly relate to the immediate safety of human life or protection of property. So just because there's an emergency going on doesn't mean that you can do this kind of broadcast, because it also means that there's no other means available. But again, you're generally not going to be very effective at communicating to the public because they're not usually listening. So you're not going to bother with a true broadcast. You may transmit to other ham radio operators, but then that's not a broadcast. When is it permissible to transmit messages encoded to hide their meaning? Here's the one exception. So this is essentially what we talk about when we talk about encryption, although if we come up with our own language to try to hide what we're saying and we start using it, that's illegal too. But the only exception is when you're transmitting command and control signals to space stations or radio control craft. Why are those the exceptions? Okay, well, if I want to send encoded communications to my remote control airplane because I don't want somebody else to be able to take control of my remote control airplane and crash it. And, you know, sometimes if you enter like the wrong password in something, you can hold the button down, it resets it, and you start it all over again. Well, try doing that with your satellite in outer space. So if somebody gets a hold of that thing and could take control over it, you can't just go up and get it and reset it. And so when you need to send a satellite commands, like adjust its orbit or open its solar array at different times, you need to make sure that somebody can't just hijack it and do that. So you're going to need to send it coded communications because it's obviously irretrievable. So those are the only exceptions. Well, space station doesn't mean International Space Station. A space station is a station in space. So a satellite. Yep. Under what conditions is an amateur station authorized to transmit music using a phone transmission? When it's incidental to an authorized retransmission of manned spacecraft communication. So when are you allowed to transmit music over the air? Never. But you are allowed, for example, to replay transmissions from the space station. So you might have recorded them and then you play it over the air for somebody else. Maybe you're relaying that communication from the space station. Well, they might have music playing on the space station and it gets picked up over the air. You're allowed to under that very, very specific and unique situation. So 99.9% of the time, you're never going to do it. But what do the rules need you to know? That if it happens incidentally because it's part of a space station retransmission, that's the one and only time. When may amateur radio operators use their stations to notify other operators of the availability of equipment for sale or trade? Remember, we're not allowed to conduct business. And the answer is when the equipment is normally used in an amateur station and such activity is not conducted on a regular basis. I could get on the air and start talking to you and then say, hey, by the way, I've got an extra antenna. Would you like to buy it? I want $50 for it. I'm not in the business of selling antennas. It's my personal property. I have one of them, or maybe I have 10 of them. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that it's not my business. It's not, I'm not trying to make money over the air. It's just related to our hobby, our shared interest together. And although I don't see them very often, but they used to have swap nets. And the net is typically conducted over a repeater. And so everybody tunes to the repeater so everybody can hear it over a wide area. And they'll say, okay, welcome to the Milford Thursday night amateur radio swap net. The purpose of this is to allow people to exchange equipment. Please check into the net if you have equipment for sale. And then I would unkey, and then somebody else would say their call sign, and then somebody else would say their call sign. And then I would go back, I'd write it down and go back to the first person and say, blah, blah, blah. Go ahead, tell us what you have. And then you would say, yeah, this is K7DN. My name is Matthew, and I have a 2-meter vertical antenna for sale, and I'm looking to get $20 for it. And then the net control operator would come back on and say, all right, thank you. Anybody who's interested in that, please stand by while we continue to get the rest of the check-ins. And then they'd go to the next person and they'd say, hi, my name is blah, blah, blah. I've got this. And then they'd go around and get the list of everything that's for sale. And then they would go back and say, okay, was anybody interested in Matthew's antenna? And somebody'd say, oh yeah, I would be interested in that. And then we might say, oh, okay, well, let me give you my phone number. And after the net, you can give me a call and we can make arrangements to meet up and sell this thing. So that's a swap net. And it's a good way to get, a lot of these things predate the internet, where it was, and now it's very easy to have email lists or web pages where you list stuff in classifieds, but these things do still happen. When must...
No auctions?
No auctions. That would not be considered very good. Although not illegal, but when must the station licensee make the station and its records available for the FCC inspection? At any time upon request by an FCC representative. So at any time, the FCC could contact you and say, we need to verify your station license and your station records. You don't have to keep records, but if you have them, and perhaps especially if you're a club station and you did have other operators there and they may have logged in, you would have that record and show them, and they might find that it was who was doing something that they weren't supposed to do. But the key thing is, when must you present it? Anytime that you're requested. What may result when correspondence from the FCC is returned as undeliverable because the grantee, that's you, failed to provide and maintain a correct mailing address? And the answer is revocation of your station license or suspension of your operator license. So I talked about this before. That's why you have to keep your address updated. You do not have to put your home address. If you have a PO box somewhere where you receive mail, that's perfectly fine, because anyone can look up whatever address you list. That's public record. So if you don't want your home address there, you could use a PO box. No, because the question was, is there a time period for an update? No, because the FCC expects that at any time that they want to contact you, you're contactable. So technically, if your mail is being forwarded for 6 months, you're still reachable. If they send you a letter in the mail, the point is, can they get a hold of you? So the time period is as soon as whatever mechanism you have in place expires and they can no longer get a hold of you, then the time period's up. Okay, so you want to know what kind of radio to get. Well, I assume by kind you mean manufacturer. Okay. That's very hard to say. So growing up, I always bought Yaesu. And Yaesu is a top manufacturer. Yaesu, Japanese. Yaesu is known for having a lot of bells and whistles, kind of like maybe the Cadillac of equipment. Not necessarily because it's the absolute best, but because it has like every bell and whistle that you can think of. I'm also very partial to ICOM, ICOM. Of course, as I mentioned at the beginning of the class, I used to work for ICOM. ICOM is definitely up there. They probably compete head to head against who's the absolute best. Kenwood is very popular. However, Kenwood is exiting the amateur market. So I would probably not want to invest in a Kenwood radio, at least unless it was a used one. If it's used, then that's fine, but I wouldn't want to maybe start out with new Kenwood equipment expecting to go, you know, oh, that's going to be my brand from here on out, because it's not going to be your brand. But yeah, between those three, you cannot go wrong.
So, Tony, this person is asking, I'm wondering about the best mid-priced handheld.
Mid-priced handheld. Well, the problem is the Chinese handhelds have brought things down to about $35 at the low end, to upwards around $100. But those are not really what I would set my start point at. The Chinese radios are perfectly fine. I own quite a few of them, so it's not like, oh, I'm a radio snob and wouldn't even have those. In fact, I don't know any radio operators that don't have them, but they're not usually their primary radio. They usually are when they start because they're cheap and you can get it and get on the air, and absolutely nothing wrong with that. The main difference is a lot of these Chinese radios are commercial radios that can be used for amateur radio. They don't program very easily. They are not particularly user friendly, and they lack a lot of ham specific features. Now they absolutely work and can get you on the air, but they're going to be complicated to program, and they're best programmed with a computer, which is not a bad thing in itself. In fact, every new radio is also computer programmable, but the original ham radios before these Chinese radios hit the market were true ham radios, and they were intended to be programmed from the radio itself, which means they do so very easily. The Chinese radios almost have to be programmed with a computer because they're so complicated, because they're not really made as a ham radio. It's really marketed as a business band commercial radio. So I would say another brand that is a Japanese brand, inexpensive, would be Alinco. They're probably, you know, they're not the top tier. They're not a ICOM, Kenwood, or Yaesu. They're kind of a mid-tier brand. In fact, maybe the only mid-tier brand, because those are the big four. But they're relatively inexpensive. Again, a true ham radio. They're easy to program. But ICOM and Yaesu both make entry-level radios that start at, I believe, around $150 and go up to probably $500 or $600. So most dual bands you can get into that $300 price point, which sure seems like a lot compared to a $35 Bofang Chinese radio, but that would be the true midpoint in an amateur radio. But nothing's wrong with these Chinese radios. You can use them. I use them. They're my, yeah, that Bofang or Wuxon, or there's quite a few different names, TYT. Everyone has one. That's what you throw in your car and rolls around your glove box and gets scratched up. And who cares? And if it gets broken, it's $35. You go buy a new one. So people do have them, but it is, once you've had a real ham radio, you'll appreciate how much nicer it is than those. But if you never knew any better, it gets you on the air.
Probably my sister needed that.
So for people online, we're still trying to get everybody else in here. So we're trying to get started here in just a minute. Okay, so we're going to start back up. What does the abbreviation RF refer to? Well, RF is radio frequency, and it refers to signals of all types. And so when we talk about, you certainly are familiar with AM and FM from your car radio. AM and FM are different modulation types. There are quite a few other modulation types. None of that matters. What they're talking about as far as RF is their radio frequency signals of all types. There are plenty of other signals that are not RF. There's AF, audio frequency, and that is any signal in the range of your hearing. There's sub-audible frequencies, which are again sound, but sounds that would be outside of human hearing. There are light waves. Light wave is very similar to RF. It's just at a much higher frequency. Even microwaves are still considered to be RF. What type of wave carries radio signals between transmitting and receiving stations? And that would be an electromagnetic wave. So that's what we're talking about here. So that would be an RF signal. A radio wave is made up of what type of energy? Electromagnetic. What are the two components of a radio wave? Electric and magnetic fields. So an RF or radio frequency wave has an electric and a magnetic field. How fast does a radio wave travel through free space? The answer is the speed of light. So light is just energy, which is also at a frequency, and the color of light determines the frequency, or rather the frequency determines the color. And especially now when you buy like LED light bulbs, you've probably seen on the light bulbs that some of them will be warm white or daylight, and that will determine the frequency of the bulb is what determines that color. All energy of every kind, so whether it's RF or light or microwaves or ultraviolet light, travels at the speed of light. And so when they talk about how fast does a radio wave travel through free space is a kind of a hypothetical environment in which there's nothing for that radio wave or energy to interact with. So an RF signal traveling through free space travels at the speed of light. As you send a radio signal down a cable or on a piece of wire, it will actually travel at less than the speed of light because it's being interacted upon by the cable or wire that it's going through. And I think we cover that a little bit later on, but that's known as the velocity factor. And the velocity factor is the rate at which the signal travels through a given wire. And so higher quality cables would have a higher velocity factor, 100% being perfect, which would be no wire could ever be that. That would be the free space number, but you'd find cables might have a velocity factor of 95%. And so the signal would travel through it at 95% the speed of light. Why is any of that even important? Well, it's important because when we go to build an antenna, the dimensions and measurements of the antenna are based on its frequency. But we also then have to take into effect the velocity factor of the wire that it's traveling through. So the antenna will actually turn out to be a bit shorter than what it needs to be based on just a pure mathematical measurement because of the velocity factor of the cable that you're using. As the description says, so radio waves, which is also traveling at the speed of light, move at 300 million meters per second. And that might seem very fast, and of course it is very fast, but when you start talking over great distances, you can communicate. So for example, if I wanted to communicate to somebody from here in Europe, I would roughly point my antenna east. That's not actually true. I'd probably really point it northeast because the earth is round, despite what some people may think. It is in fact round, and it doesn't just go straight east, it's actually curved with the earth, and so it would be kind of more northeast. But could I point my antenna in the opposite direction and reach Europe? Of course, because again, the earth's round, so I could go the long path, is what they call that. And I have heard, not on an amateur station, but on very high-powered broadcast transmitters in the shortwave bands, you will actually hear the signal echo. And what's happening, why it's echoing, is because the signal is reaching me directly, and then it's coming around the long way and hitting me again, and there's enough delay because 300 million meters per second is not fast enough to go around the earth to be instantaneous, and I hear the signal literally twice, just a slight delay from the first time, and it sounds like an echo. So when you communicate with satellites in outer space, when you bounce your signal off the moon, there is a perceptible delay. And in fact, when you bounce your signal off the moon, you will actually hear your own signal. Because as I said, it showers down over the whole earth, everything facing the moon at that time. And so when you stop transmitting, you will hear the very tail end of your own transmission because it took that much time for it to get up there and then come back down. So it's kind of a neat, interesting thing. So why do all these things matter? Because we can actually experience them, and it does affect when we build antennas and things. Oh, it's generally about a half a second or so. Yeah. Yeah, it's enough that you clearly hear your own signal, but it's not like you're waiting. Oh, there it is. You know, it's not that fast. The other thing about this is like when NASA is sending pictures from Mars, I believe it takes something on the order of a minute or so for that signal to get here. So once they start transmitting, everything is delayed. So if you were trying to remote control a buggy or a satellite or something, and it's in Mars, and you have to give it a command and realize that that command won't even be received for minutes. It's not instantaneous like we're used to here. And I do know that, so the distance from the sun to the earth, it takes 8 minutes for that, for a signal, if it would originate at the sun to reach the earth. It takes that long. So what is the approximate velocity of a radio wave as it travels through free space? 300 million meters per second. What describes the number of times per second that an alternating current makes a complete cycle? And the answer is frequency. So that is how we determine frequency. So we have, this line represents time. Okay, this line represents amplitude, which also then is frequency. Okay, so everybody has probably seen and maybe not noticed or paid attention to it, but on the back of virtually every single thing that you plug into the wall, it will tell you this is 120 volts and 60 hertz. What that 60 hertz means is that its signal oscillates from the positive side to the negative side. It oscillates 60 times per second. And if you had a meter, an old analog meter, and it was very fast, it's unfortunately even 60 times a second is fast for that meter. But if you took a meter and put it on there, you would actually see the needle flick like that as it crosses from the positive to the negative. So it'd flick up and then drop down and then flick up and drop down. You would see that based on the frequency of what you're measuring. And so in Europe, their power is usually 240 volts at 50 hertz. So theirs oscillates back and forth 50 times, where ours does 60 times. And so that is frequency. The other thing that you need to learn, and it's coming up in there, is the units of frequency. One oscillation, so just one of this from here to here, is a hertz. That's one oscillation. Hertz is a measurement of frequency. So if it oscillates once per second, it's 1 hertz. When we're talking about the repeaters, that example that I gave you, I drew up here, and that was 443.350. That is oscillating at 4 million and 443 million times per second, because that's megahertz. So it's 443,350,000 oscillations per second.
So when you say mega, you're adding 3 more zeros on it.
Yeah, well, mega means million. So 1 megahertz is 1 million hertz.
How does it go in order? So it goes from hertz.
Yeah. So this is really important for you to know, not only for this test, but for the future and just to understand things in general. So we start up here with hertz. Then we start with kilohertz. Okay, so an example is 1 hertz, 1,000. I don't want to confuse you. 1,000 hertz is 1 kilohertz. Okay, so I'm going to put the decimal point there so that we can understand that 1 kilohertz is 1,000 hertz. Then we have megahertz, which is 1 million hertz. And then we have gigahertz, which is 1 billion hertz. And that is not, oh, wow, it just goes up really high. And that's not very useful. No, in fact, your license class has a semi-popular frequency that's at 1.2 gigahertz. It runs from 1.24 gigahertz to 1.3 gigahertz. So,
That's how many times it oscillates per second.
yes.
That's crazy.
Yep. Yep, it is. And so all these can be broken down. So if I said, oh, I'm operating at, 1200 hertz, well, I could say, 1200 hertz, or I could say 1.2 kilohertz. It's exactly the same. I could say, oh, I'm operating at 1200 megahertz or 1.2 gigahertz. I'm just moving that decimal place 3. That's all I'm doing. Yeah. So you could even see, well, you've got a station that operates at 7,260 kilohertz. That would not be an uncommon thing to hear referenced. Okay, but what is that in megahertz? Anybody? 7.2. Yep, it's just 7.2 megahertz. So I take my decimal spot, which is here, 1, 2, 3, and now that becomes 7.2 megahertz. That just takes practice. The important thing is to know it. And although you cannot bring any written materials into your test with you, it is entirely acceptable for you as you sit down with your test to write out a little chart so that you can remember, or that way when your brain's fried and you don't have to try to recalculate everything. It's no problem for you to do that. You just can't bring that chart in with you. There are a few. It definitely is more in your general, but understanding the units of measurement is important, especially becomes very important in your general class. Yes, the book does have a chart in there that explains that. Yep. Because when you start getting into the electronic components like resistors and capacitors, especially capacitors and inductors, they deal in these units of measurement on the small scale instead of the large scale. So instead of being here is 1 and here is 1,000, it's going from here's 1 to here's 100th to here's 1,000th to here's 1,000,000th. I mean, it's going with the decimal place in the opposite direction. So understanding how to move between these scales is important. What is the approximate velocity of a radio wave as it travels through free space? 300 million meters per second. What describes the number of times per cycle? Oh, I must have skipped over. Okay. Yep. So number of times per cycle is frequency. What is the unit of frequency? Hertz. Yep. Hertz. What is the proper abbreviation for megahertz? And the answer is D, capital M, capital H, lowercase z. Megahertz means million hertz, or 1,000,000 cycles per second. If you find some very old AM radios, some of which might have shortwave, they will even refer to them as cycles or kilocycles. But cycle is just one cycle, which is the measurement of frequency, which is done in megahertz. If a frequency display calibrated in megahertz shows a reading of 3.525 megahertz, what would it show if it were calibrated in kilohertz? Okay, so we have megahertz and we need to convert it to kilohertz. So megahertz is bigger than kilohertz, right? Which means we're going to move the decimal place 3 places to the right. Yep. So if we're at 3.525, we need to go 1, 2, 3. That would put us at 3,525. And the way you can remember which way does the decimal place move is we know that megahertz is bigger. So if we're converting to kilohertz, the number is going to have to be bigger. Because if we move it in the other direction, the number is going to get real small because it would be 0.00 something. I don't know. The question was, how come if megahertz is capitalized, kilohertz isn't? I'm not sure. I'm not even sure if that's that could be a typo in the book.
So what you're saying is it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. People would understand. It does matter for megahertz, certainly. Yep. What is the name for the distance a radio wave travels through one complete cycle? So the answer to this is wavelength. So in the book, we've talked about different wavelengths. And the wavelength is not the frequency. It's not the number of times that it goes, that it cycles per second. This is talking about what is the distance a radio wave travels. And so we have different wavelengths because different frequencies are on different wavelengths. Those different wavelengths are what give light different colors. Okay, so your eye picks up light. It's all light, right? It is, except different frequencies show up into your eye as a different color. And so they have a different wavelength. The way that we calculate wavelength might help to understand that, and it's definitely comes up in your book. (300) divided by the frequency in megahertz, which means if the frequency you're given isn't in megahertz, what do you have to do? Convert it to megahertz. Why you need to know that? Because it may not be given to you in megahertz. So this is the frequency in megahertz. 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz. So if the frequency is 150, anybody want to give that answer? 2, yep. 2 meters. That's the 2 meter band. And you're going to look in your book and say, no, my book says that the 2 meter band is from 144 to 148. That's correct. It's not an exact thing. They didn't. So our 2 meter band is 144 to 148. No problem. Put 144 or 148 or any number in between there, and what's it going to come out to? Something incredibly close to this, and no other answer will be anywhere close. So if I told you your frequency is 144 megahertz, what is the wavelength? You'll do 300 divided by 144. You're going to come up with 300 divided by 144. You're going to come up with 2.0833333. The answers on the test are going to be 2 meters, 6 meters, 10 meters, 20 meters. Only 2 meters was anywhere close. So for the purpose of your test, that approximation is fine. And in reality, when they call it the 2 meter band, they're not telling you, because they don't want to call it the 2.08333 meter band. That's silly. That's why they do it that way. That's why this is important. 2 meters. So this represents the distance that the signal travels in one oscillation. When we build antennas based on the wavelength of the frequency. Now, they're usually in some form. The most basic antenna would be a quarter wavelength. So 1/4 of that. So 2 meters literally means 2 meters, which is 6 feet. Yes, it's that question right there. Yes. Yep. So we have this frequency, which is covering a distance of 2 meters per wavelength, per oscillation. We are going to build a quarter wave antenna. So let's just convert this to 6 feet. And we're going to take a quarter of that, which comes out to 1 point something feet, 1.x feet. And it turns out that it's approximately 19 inches. So you don't have to understand why we're building a quarter wave antenna. Just understand that we are building a quarter wave antenna for this frequency. That means you can then also understand that if I'm going to transmit on a completely different frequency, like 443 megahertz, the antenna size for that is going to be completely different. And in fact, it's going to be about 6 inches. So this antenna would be way too long. So now when you see a ham radio operator's house or their car and you wonder why they have a lot of antennas, it's because although this antenna at 19 inches can probably cover that 144 to 148 range with acceptable performance, it definitely can't cover 443. So I'm going to need another antenna. And so pretty much every band that you're going to operate on, and in your book it talks about the 2 meters and 6 meters and 1.25 meters and 20 meters and 10 meters. Every band that you're going to operate on needs an antenna. What would be the wrong length? Which length are you going to pick? That's the problem, because you have an antenna that's 19 inches long. Well, it's 19 inches long. It's going to be too long for that other frequency, or too short for a different one.
So it's driven by how the wave runs up and down the antenna.
Right. So antennas have what we call a resonance, and that resonance is how they can receive that signal. And when an antenna is not resonant, you have an inefficiency. It does radiate the signal, but it doesn't radiate it as well. And ultimately, if it's too poor, it just won't work. It could even damage your radio. Because what happens is your radio, imagine if you had if you sent your signal out and your signal was in the shape of a square, right? And you just got to go through a round hole. What's going to happen? It's going to hit that round hole, get the edges cut off, and whatever else will go through, but whatever was left gets reflected back at your radio. Your radio can only handle so much being reflected back before it breaks. Where if you have the perfectly aligned antenna, whatever's sent to it is exactly what that antenna radiates out. It is oscillating. That's correct. So what happens is it's called reflected power. So you're going to send power down the cable. It's going to hit the antenna, and the antenna, if it's resonant, will fully radiate that signal into the air. If it's off resonance, it will radiate some of the signal, and some will get reflected back. We don't want that reflected back power.
So when I say power, it's different for 3 or 4 different radios. How do they keep interfering with each other? Aren't they all picking up, and some of them picking up well, some of them picking up poorly?
Yeah, they would.
So I'm sending signal to the radio, and the radio, and the other one's doing the right thing.
Well, but the thing is, if I have an antenna, if I have a radio that's connected to my 19-inch antenna, it's going to be tuned to the frequency for that. And yes, this antenna will still pick up that same signal, but it's also connected to a radio that's not listening there, so it's just disregarded.
Okay, a couple of questions from the Zoomers. Can we have an antenna wired for 2 wavelengths?
Yes.
Okay. Number 2, can you do the antenna equation one more time?
Yes. So let me first talk about how can you have an antenna wired for 2 wavelengths. Okay. There are, and it's beyond my understanding, So you just have to accept that it is what it is. There are certain fractional wavelengths that work better than others. I cannot explain to you why. But quarter wave, half wave, 5/8 wave, and full wave are these common wavelengths in antennas that work very well, that emit the signal and allow it to be emitted without reflecting too much power back. So you just have to accept that those are what works, and why doesn't another one work? Because it doesn't. I can't explain that. So for example, on the 6-meter band, if you have a quarter wave antenna, it also happens to be a 5/8 wave on 2 meters. How convenient. You could also imagine that if you have a half wave antenna on 80 meters, it's a full wave antenna on 40 meters, because 40 meters is half of 80 meters. So, and they did that on purpose. It's like that on purpose. And you could also imagine that your full wave antenna on 20 meters is still a quarter wave antenna on 80 meters. So, because they're harmonically related. There is another way, and you will commonly see it in mobile and base station antennas, and even on your handheld radios. You have a dual band antenna. That means that antenna covers 2 bands. You will have an antenna that looks somewhat like this. You will notice that if you take the measurement, this will be about 6 inches, but from here to the top will be 19 inches. Coils act like blocking devices to certain radio frequencies. And so your radio, when it transmits on a small wavelength that utilizes this section of the antenna, hits this section and then hits this coil and is just blocked. This part of the antenna looks invisible to that frequency. It just doesn't even see it. But yet, because the wavelength is so much longer on that other frequency, it doesn't even see that there's a coil there. It acts like there's no coil there, and it just utilizes the full length. That's how you can get a dual band antenna. So well, it's dependent on the frequency. The coil is tuned for whichever frequency you're trying to block, and the other frequency doesn't get blocked by the coil. It just blows right through it. Okay, so they were asked, how do you do the formula for figuring out the wavelength? Okay, it's 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz.
And what is the 300 represent?
300 represents 300 million meters per second. If you wanted to, you could do 300 million divided by the frequency in hertz. But because we're doing 300, the frequency has to be in megahertz. But we don't want to work with huge numbers. That's why we do 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz. Always in megahertz?
Cancel the units.
Cancel your units out.
Yeah, can do that. So here's 300 million divided by so 300 million divided by 150 million, which is 150 million hertz. But if I want to deal with the smaller numbers, I take away these three, and they do this cancel out on the bottom. And so now I just have 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz. So it's 150 megahertz. Just remember, always convert this to megahertz. So if I gave you the frequency, if I gave you the frequency 14.2 megahertz, what would that be? 14.2 megahertz. And so if you want to do it in your head, just round it up. 15. How many times does 15 go into 30? 2. Carry that 0. Now we're at 20. So if this was 14.2 megahertz, but we're rounding up to 15. And if we use 15 goes into 300, it goes in 20 times. 14.2 megahertz is the 20 meter band on ham radio. Okay. Hopefully everybody understands that. If not, we can come back to it. Okay. What property of radio waves is often used to identify different frequency bands? The answer is A, the approximate wavelength. So if I tell you, oh, I operate on 2 meters. Well, that's great. That's the approximate wavelength, and you would know, oh, well, ham radio goes from 144 to 148. That's the 2 meter band. Just like if I said, well, I operate on 20 meters. Well, 20 meters would be 15 megahertz, but there's no ham radio band there. But you would know, oh, 14.2 megahertz, that is the ham band at 20 meters. So that's why they're referring to that. And you'll hear people, you don't hear people usually say, oh, I'm getting on 7 megahertz tonight. They don't say that. They would say, I'm getting on 40 meters tonight. Or I'm getting on 20 meters tonight. And you'd know you'd find them somewhere at 14.2. What does the wavelength of how does the wavelength of a radio wave relate to its frequency? The wavelength gets shorter as the frequency increases. So higher frequencies have smaller or shorter wavelengths. Lower frequencies have longer wavelengths. That's a good way to remember it. Lower, longer. So you have a lower frequency, you have the longer wavelength. So if the lower the frequency, the longer the wavelength. If you have VHF and UHF antennas, are they going to be bigger or smaller than HF antennas? Remember, HF is the lowest portions. So HF antennas are big antennas. Yeah. They get to be very big antennas. A lot of people will build simple wire antennas, literally just a piece of wire. Okay. But that wire antenna could be, well, simple to figure out. On 80 meters, if you have a quarter wavelength wire antenna, how long is the antenna? A quarter of 80 meters, which is 20 meters. 20 meters is 60 feet. So you'd have an antenna that's 60 feet long, 60-foot piece of wire. It can be. It will affect it, but it can be. Ideally, we would love to have the wire perfectly straight, but if it has to make a little dog leg at the end because you run up against your property line, that still works. Yeah. But it will affect how it radiates its signal. What is the formula for converting frequency to the approximate wavelength in meters? Hope nobody gets this one wrong because we just went through that. Yeah, it's 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz. So this is in your book. So it's just another little reminder of how you do that. What frequency range is referred to as HF? And for this, I want to go back to the board because I want to just cover them all. They do make it fairly easy. 3 to 30 megahertz is HF. 30 to 300 is VHF. 300 to 3000 is UHF. And 3000 up is microwave. So when it asks what is the frequency range referred to as HF, it's 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz. And so as I mentioned, where are microwave frequencies located? Above 3000 megahertz. See, when people were naming these things, they didn't really, back in the old days, why do we call HF, high frequency? That's a very low frequency. But back when they were naming them, that was a high frequency because they were used to working in things much, much lower. They didn't have the technology to operate in frequencies very high. And so that was a high frequency back then. But today we look at it like that's silly, but they named it over 100 years ago. I'm sorry, what is your question? Yeah, so I have an extra class, and as an extra class, I have more frequencies in the HF range than you do. That's, yes. Yep. So why do they call a microwave a microwave? Well, it's because it supposedly emits microwave radiation, a microwave signal. But in fact, of course, again, they named these things a long time ago. Microwaves are in fact above 3,000 megahertz. Your microwave operates at 2,450 megahertz. So in fact, your microwave is indeed not a microwave. So why do they pick that frequency and why don't they use a different one that is in the microwave? Your microwave is at the frequency it's at because the wavelength of that signal resonates, means it finds something in which to interact with perfectly. And that thing that it interacts with perfectly is water. Water. And that's how your microwave works. It sends a signal no different than the one that's in your radio, just at a different frequency. And that signal has enough energy in it, so it's a high-powered signal, and it causes water molecules to vibrate in your food, and that vibration causes friction, and it causes your food to become warm. If you took something that had no water in it, like sand, perfectly dry sand, and it had no moisture, no metallic in it, or ceramic. Ceramic's very dry. Put something ceramic in your microwave and turn your microwave on for a minute. When it goes off, you can pick that right up. It won't be hot at all because there's no water molecules to vibrate, so therefore it doesn't get hot. Your microwave isn't magic. It works by vibrating water molecules. Now, if you don't like the idea that your 98% made of water body can be affected by a microwave, well, you might also then want to be aware that that 2.45 gigahertz or 2,450 megahertz frequency that is in your microwave oven is also the exact frequency that Wi-Fi runs on, that's in your house and that's in your cell phone. So you are carrying around the exact same transmitter that heats up and cooks food in your shirt pocket, microwaving your body. However, the power level is so low, it doesn't cause cellular damage. Also, and I know it's covered, RF radiation is non-ionizing radiation. Ionizing radiation is what comes off of like plutonium and uranium that causes cellular damage. RF radiation is non-ionizing radiation. So HF is from 3 to 30 megahertz. And so we're going to remember 3 to 30 megahertz is HF, 30 to 300 is VHF, 300 to 3000 is UHF, and above 3000 is microwave. There'll be other questions on your test that say, you know, what is the VHF range? Ultra, yep, ultra high frequency, very high frequency for VHF. Okay, what is the maximum peak envelope power output for a technician class operator using their assigned portions on the HF bands? And the answer is 200 watts. This is just something to know. This is a regulation. When you say, what is the maximum amount of power that you as a technician are allowed to use on HF? And the answer is 200 watts. Once you go to a general class, you'll be able to operate at 1,500 watts. Yeah, so peak envelope power would be the maximum peak power. So if we were looking at this waveform here, we're looking at that signal, that would be the peaks. And especially when you talk, some words are softer, and usually things like S's are sharp and jabbing, you'd see the spikes. So that would be your peak envelope power. Watts are a unit of measurement of power. Just like volts is the measurement of voltage, watts is the measurement of power. So it's how much power is your radio putting out. That's the unit of measurement. Maybe. It depends. I mean, so the question was, does a battery powered radio use or have more wattage than a one that's plugged in? Well, if your radio, if you have a 10-watt radio versus a 50-watt radio, the 50-watt radio is 5 times more powerful. Watts is a unit of measurement. Not necessarily, because the signal itself, depending on its wavelength and the characteristics of that. So you have to compare things equally. So if you have a 2-meter radio that's 10 watts and I have a same 2-meter radio with the same antenna, but my radio is 50 watts, I'm going to transmit 5 times more power. Does that mean I'll get 5 times further? Not necessarily, but it means when the signal is received at a given point, mine will be 5 times stronger. It's just a unit of power. Okay, so the question is, what does stronger do, or what does that mean? Okay, well, so if we had our antenna, and our antenna picks up the signal, and remember, it's going to pick up a resonant signal better than any other. It picks up that signal. It literally takes a voltage out of the air, that signal, and sends it down the wire. So if I have a stronger signal that I'm sending out, there'll be more voltage to be received at the other end. And so at the other end, the receiving station is going to receive a more powerful signal. No. Okay. Well, how is it useful would be, let's say that there's a noise in the neighborhood, in my area, and it's causing some amount of static. Well, there's going to be, if here's no signal, and here's the maximum signal I could possibly hear, and all this, but I have noise in my neighborhood, here's noise. Well, if your signal is in or comes above, but sometimes dip below that noise, I'm not going to be able to receive you as reliably. But if you are transmitting a more powerful signal and it's always above the noise, I'm always going to be able to receive it clearly. Well, I would say a more powerful signal overcomes interference better. I would not want to say clarity because...
So if you want to have a voice contest, I'll win.
Yep. What are the frequency limits for the VHF spectrum? Okay. So 300 to 3,000. Oh, I'm sorry. 330 to 300. And then here's the chart. This chart is again in your book, and it breaks down. It's very hard to see on the screen. I know online guys cannot see it at all, but This breaks down. Here is the 3 megahertz. Here's 30, and this is HF. Here's 30 to 300 VHF, and 300 to 3000 is UHF. So it goes through all of that. Yes. Yeah, they want to make sure that you catch that kilohertz or not megahertz. Yeah. Page 60 in the book. Okay, good. What are the frequency limits for UHF? So 300 to 3000. Except for some specific restrictions, what is the maximum peak envelope power output for a technician class operator using frequency above 30 megahertz? So above 30 megahertz, we're talking about VHF. This is primarily the area for technician class licenses, and you are allowed to transmit with 1500 watts of power. That's a lot. That's a whole lot. Your handheld radio is probably 5 watts. Your mobile radio is between 30 and 50 watts. Most HF base stations are only 100 watts. So you're going to be utilizing some kind of an amplifier to get up that much power. And you're going to be doing something very specific to want to use that much power. That's 200 watts for HF frequencies, which would be frequencies below 30 megahertz. No, the question earlier was, as a technician class license, what is the maximum peak envelope power for HF frequencies? And that's 200 watts for HF. And so your frequencies above 30 megahertz, which would be VHF, UHF, and microwave, you're generally, there are some exceptions, but generally permitted 1500 watts. No, general class licenses are the ones that gain a lot of frequency in HF. You have a little. No. No. We haven't covered that in the class yet. Which frequency is within the 6 meter amateur band? I do not really have a good helper for this. Now, figuring out 6 meters is easy. It's something you do. It's 300 divided by 6 will give you 50. But we also know that those frequencies are oftentimes approximate. So there are 2 that are really close and 2 that are obviously not it. So it gets you down to 50-50. In this case, it tells you 50 megahertz, and there's only one that starts with 50, and in fact, that is correct. So how do you do that? You kind of just start to learn the frequency ranges. But this at least gets you down to a 50-50 shot on that question. And the 6 meter band goes from 50 to 54 megahertz. So that one is right in the middle of that 6 meter band.
So then 49 is the 5 meter band. That's why it's not here.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you know it goes from 50 to the bottom?
That's because I know it. Yeah.
There's math behind it somewhere.
There really isn't, because if you, it's, why does 2 meter go from 144 to 148 when 2 meters is actually 150 megahertz? It's remember, it's an approximation, and we were just given the range of 144 to 148, and on 6 meters, we're given the range of 50 to 54. It's just, it is what the ITU carved out for everybody. Yeah, pretty much. It was just, they threw darts at a board and said, yep, that's what we'll give them. So, yeah, so the formula works both ways. So 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz gives you the meters, or 300 divided by the meters gives you the megahertz. Meter band. Yeah. Which amateur band are you using when your station is transmitting on 146.52? Okay, let's round that up to 150. 300 divided by 150 goes in twice. Oh, I'm on the 2 meter band. Right, and when you round it, even if you do 300 divided by the frequency, it's going to come out to 2.0 something. There's only one that even is 2. They don't get that close. It's meant that you should be able to do this in your head, although you're permitted to bring a calculator. The calculator can't be your phone, and it can't be a programmable. It needs to be a dumb calculator. Go to Dollar Tree or $1.25 Tree, whatever they call it now. But they've got calculators for $1, and they're basic, perfect for this test. Calculator. Yep. How fast are you at taking the test? Well, then it'll be super slow.
What's the maximum?
There is no time limit. There's only 35 questions on the test. So even if you took a minute, 35 minutes into the test. So it would be shocking for someone to take more than an hour at the test, but most people, and that's the whole idea, especially for the people online that aren't here. Your goal after this class is for the next week to just pour through your book, quiz with somebody else, and then to take the practice tests on the internet. You need to take practice tests, and that's basically going through the book and quizzing yourself. Test after test after test until your eyes start bleeding. Then you take a break, and then you do it again. The point is, you just take that practice test over and over and over again, and you'll start seeing either the exact same questions over and over again, because eventually you'll go through them all, or you'll start seeing the pattern of questions that are asking you, about certain frequency bands. Oh, I know that, or I know that formula, so I know how to calculate that out. And even if you didn't have that exactly memorized, you could easily work out what the right answer is. Because when the questions that are in your book and the questions that are on these practice tests online are the exact questions that'll be on your test. They're going to just pick from the pool, 35 of them, and that's what you'll get. So in theory, if you could just memorize every question and answer in the book, you'll get 100% on the test. You know nothing. You could not understand, you could even not know how to read English if you could just match up the question to the answer, 100%. Yeah. Yeah. All right. So Practice tests can be taken at QRZ, Quebec Romeo Zulu.com. There are many, many others. That's one that I know well and recommend. You need to create an account. It's free, and you'll actually use that website a lot when you become a ham radio operator anyways. And so you can take practice tests there. What is the national calling frequency for FM simplex operations in the 2-meter band? Now, this is just a rote memorization type thing. There's nothing, no tricks about this, but I do want to break down what the question means so that you understand. 2-meter band, what are we talking about? Yeah, so it's 300 divided by 2, which is 150. So we already know we've got a 50-50 chance. It's one of those two answers. Okay, we're talking about simplex operations. What does that mean? That means not through a repeater. That's 1-to-1. It's me to somebody else. There's nothing in between us. National calling frequency. This would be if I want to try to connect with random people. Hey, anybody out there? Essentially, you're going to go to that national calling frequency, because when you're not trying to talk to a repeater and you want to just find somebody to talk to, or if you're driving down the highway in a strange area where there might be repeaters, but you don't know what they are, and you want to get a hold of somebody for help or just to talk to somebody, you would go on the national calling frequency. Okay, so we've got it down to a 50-50 shot, and the answer is 146,520. Why is it that? Because that's what somebody picked it to be. That's all there is to it. What is the limitation for emissions on the frequencies between 219 and 220 megahertz? And the answer is fixed digital message forwarding systems only. These would be data systems, data messages.
What are these emissions? It's not a vehicle. Like,
Right. So we talked before about frequency being a transmission, a radio frequency. The emission would be how that transmission is formatted. FM, AM, single sideband, data. Those are all radio signals, but it's how is the information put into that signal. You know, you've listened to the AM radio in your car, it's staticky and doesn't have a very good sound quality compared to FM. So you know there's a difference between AM and FM. And so fixed digital message, so it's talking about data. So this is a data emission. The emission type is some form of data. So could you get on there and start talking with your voice? No, because it's not a digital message. It's digital voice. It might be digital, but it's voice still. This is talking about fixed message, digital messages, these data messages like email, for example. What is a band plan beyond the privileges established by the FCC? The answer is a voluntary guideline for using different modes or activities within an amateur band. The FCC said you can transmit from here to here, 144 to 148. That's the 2-meter band. What this is talking about, a band plan, is it's a voluntary guideline. So people have gotten together and they've said, we want repeaters to operate here. We want Morse code to operate here. And we want sideband to operate here, and we want digital systems to operate here. Why? Well, because if somebody's sending Morse code through a repeater, that would get annoying because a repeater is for people to talk through. And so this is just a gentleman's agreement, a voluntary guideline for where you're going to do things within the allotted frequencies. So this is not law. FCC says you can transmit from here to here. This is a voluntary guideline that says you do certain types of transmissions in certain segments. Which of the following is a result of the fact that the amateur radio service is secondary in all or portions of some amateur bands, such as portions of the 70 centimeter band? And the answer is U.S. amateurs may find non-amateur stations within these portions and must avoid interfering with them. So what this is saying is you have a frequency range that you're allowed to transmit it, but there can be in some bands where we are considered secondary. There's a primary user. That means they have a certain range within our range, or in fact, it's our range is within theirs because they're the primary, where you could find non-amateur traffic. And that's fine. And what do you do about that? You avoid interfering with it.
But you could listen.
Yeah, you could listen. You just can't transmit. Now, if they're not there, and they may not be everywhere, maybe they are in Ohio, but they're not out in Washington State, whoever that user is. Well, then people in Washington could transmit there, but people in Ohio couldn't. So it just,
How would we know?
you would hear them.
Okay.
Yeah.
We can theoretically tune the frequency.
But you can always listen. There's no restriction on listening to anything.
But I'm just not allowed to speak.
Yeah, you can't interfere with them. So if they're operating there, you can't.
How can we do that? Speak with officers?
No. If you operate there, you'll interfere with them, and that's against the law.
So it's been so, but I'm concerned about like the Air Force is close to where I live. So, and of course, they fly over. So, what I asked them, here's something that should just shut it down. You can listen, you just wouldn't want to speak into it. But how do I know which one it is?
Well, you could find out where amateurs are not primary and completely choose to avoid that range, or you could choose to listen and see if there are operations there that you might interfere with.
I would know what they're talking about.
Well, you would hear that they're not identifying with amateur call signs. Yep.
That's a good.
Because they're not amateurs. They're doing whatever they're doing. Yep.
So wait 10 minutes. There's no call sign.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say in general, because those operations do exist, not everywhere, but in certain places, hams tend to avoid them anyways. So odds are when you're going to talk to somebody else, you're not going to be in those places because there's not going to be somebody there to talk to. And if you are doing something in there that's, maybe you're setting up a high-speed data link between you and somebody else, by the time you get that advanced to want to do something like that, you'll be much more comfortable and familiar with it, and it won't be an issue.
So, okay, random question. What I'm hearing is we need to start kind of viewing these things almost like strip malls. And there are places that we're going to frequent, whether it's the stores that we like to go to and our friends show up there. And then there's the, data center down this that no one goes to, and you'll just know. So instead of viewing it like this linear thing, it almost becomes a life.
Yep.
And you'll familiarize yourself with that life.
Yeah, so as a technician class, your primary operating privileges are within VHF and UHF. And so you're going to get your Bofang radio, or maybe upgrade to an ICOM radio, a handheld or a mobile, And you'll use a mobile as a base station in your house with a power supply. And where are you going to go to find people? Well, you'll probably go to those repeaters that are in the area. And you'll probably find that almost everybody is there, because otherwise it's hundreds of frequencies to pick from, because it's a huge range. It's not like a channel. It's not like CB, channel 1, channel 2. You have this huge range of frequencies. And so trying to find somebody randomly on some random frequency within the range is not very good. So people congregate on the repeaters. And then you might find that, well, they don't want to tie up the repeaters. And so there'll be a group that every evening gets on a simplex frequency, so not a repeater frequency. And that's where they go. But they'll say, hey, join us on the simplex frequency, 146.58. And you'll go there and you'll know it's okay, because that's where they all are. And that's where you'll talk. But you'll find that you spend almost all your time on repeaters. Certainly you can use simplex, and certainly there's way more to ham radio than that. But starting out, that's where everybody goes, and that's where everybody will be. They may be doing other things also, but they'll be on the repeaters. Why should you not set your transmit frequency to be exactly at the edge of the amateur band or sub band? Remember when I drew this waveform? Imagine your transmission, which this is representative of a transmission. If I said that you can transmit from, say it's going vertically like this. Here's 144. This is the very bottom. And the very top right here is 148. Well, if you tune your radio to that very highest frequency that you're allowed to transmit on, your signal will go partially above and below. And that would actually put you outside of the range. So you would actually need to transmit, somewhere down here, so that when your signal went like that, it only bumped up against the edge. So you would never want to operate on the extreme edge of the frequencies, because your signal will spill out.
How would you know if it was?
Well, because it always does that. Okay. So your an FM signal from your 2-meter radio is 25 kilohertz wide. So if your radio is tuned to 145.000, your radio will actually be covering from 144.9 Yeah, yes, but it's 12 and a half. 8, 7, 5. It'll go from 144.9875 to 145.00125. So if, yes. Yep, centered at whatever frequency it's tuned to. So if you dial it to 145, that's with the frequency that you say you're operating on, but you have a width, an amount of bandwidth on either side of that center frequency. That's why we have different modes of communication. So FM is about 25 kilohertz wide. They have narrowband FM. Narrowband FM is still FM, but it only uses 12.5. So it'd be 6.25 on each side. If you use digital modes, so some of those digital voice modes where you're talking, they could only use 6.25 kilohertz of bandwidth. So they're very narrow. So they're using 3.125 on each side. When you listen to those modes, you'll know that they're narrow because the voice quality sounds not as good, that's for sure. And when you listen to a lot of digital communications, you'll hear it doesn't sound right. So on HF, we hardly ever use FM on HF. And that's because FM is 25 kilohertz wide. Our HF bands are usually very small. We have a very small range of frequencies, not like in the VHF and UHF where we have very wide ranges. So on HF, we'll use single sideband. That's just a voice mode. And in single sideband, it takes up much less. And in fact, it's usually about 3 kilohertz wide. So how do you know if your radio is going over? It always does. And by how much depends on what mode you're using. And so generally, do you operate at the very edge? No, you would just never do that. Yep.
Did you talk about frequency modulation?
Not yet. Nope. So these are the reasons to why you do not set your transmit frequency to exactly be on the edge, and it's all the above. Well, what if your radio is miscalibrated? So you think you're dialing to something, but yet it's slightly off. Usually doesn't happen in modern radios, but remember this, you can build your own ham radio. You're allowed to build your own radio, so you may have a mistake in there. So that the modulation sidebands do not extend beyond the band edge. That's that waveform, right? And so that doesn't extend beyond. Also to allow the transmitter to drift. Sometimes, especially in old transmitters, usually not an issue today, but the transmit frequency, even though it might be correct, as it warms up or cools down, will actually shift. And that's a lot of old crystal type radios. I mean, we're talking really old stuff, experiences that. Okay, what is meant by the abbreviation PTT? The answer is push to talk. Okay, pretty simple. And the function is that it switches between transmit and receive. Now, you might be on the repeater, as I said before, transmitting on one frequency and receiving on another. Or if you're simplex, you transmit and receive on the same frequency, but your receiver is being shut off while you're transmitting. And so that's what the push to talk button is doing. That's also why you don't need to manipulate your radio to go back and forth. It's doing it automatically. What is a way to enable quick access to your favorite frequency on your transceiver? Store the frequency in a memory channel. No different than your car stereo. You've got memories on there, so your ham radio will have a memory. What is the disadvantage of the rubber duck antenna supplied with most dual band transceivers when compared to a full-size quarter wave antenna? And the answer is it does not transmit or receive as effectively. Okay? A quarter wave on 2 meters is 19 inches long. Do you want to walk around with a handheld radio with a 19-inch long antenna on it? Maybe there could be times when that's not weird and inappropriate, but most of the time that's a nuisance. And so you have an antenna that's much smaller, probably about 8 inches long. Is that going to work as well as a proper length, full-size antenna? No. Simple and easy to understand. They want you to understand that. And you can go buy the larger size antennas for better performance. If you're out hiking in places, you might need or want that longer antenna, and it's not a problem. It's, it's mounted on your backpack, and when you need to use it, you'll be glad that you have that better working, more efficient antenna when you're out in the woods. But if you're walking around here in town or whatever, and you've got your radio in a bag, you don't need that long antenna because you're close to the repeater. So that's why it comes with that. And it's called the rubber duck antenna because somebody called it that. I don't know.
What is the,
I'm sorry?
what is circularly polarized?
So the question is, what is circularly polarized signals? Signals are radiated in a polarity, and that polarity is in relation to the ground. So you could have vertically polarized signal, which means that wavelength is in its vertical fashion. You could have horizontally polarized, so it's moving this way. And you could have circularly polarized, which means it's spinning. And as you could imagine, if I have a vertically polarized antenna here, and I have a vertically polarized antenna here, and I send my signal to it vertically, it hits along the full surface of the antenna and receives well. If I have a horizontally polarized antenna, and it's moving horizontally, and it hits, it's only a very small portion that gets the signal, and you'll actually receive a weak signal, up to half as weak as if you would use the proper polarization. So unofficially it's standardized. So FM signals are traditionally vertical. Why? Because if you use that in your car, can you have a horizontal antenna? You don't want an antenna sticking off the side of your car. It sticks up at the top. So that's why they use that. A lot of noise, like radio interference, things from the atmosphere and man-made signals tend to be vertical. So when you use sideband, which is a weak signal mode, they'll go horizontal because then those man-made noises hit it and they don't impact as much. And because you could use that at your house, they use horizontal antennas, looking like a TV antenna. Those are horizontal, the old TV antennas. Yep, so that's horizontally polarized. Where do you see circularly polarized? Well, what orientation is your antenna? If it's on your car, it's sticking up, that's vertical. And if it's mounted horizontally at your house, that's horizontal. What orientation is the antenna going to be on a satellite spinning in outer space? It's circular. It's because it's spinning around. That's why you have circular polarized. Yep. What is a disadvantage of using a handheld VHF transceiver with its integral antenna inside of a vehicle? So you're sitting in your car, you've got your handheld radio with its antenna built onto it, and you're talking on it. What's going to be a disadvantage? Well, the signal may not propagate well due to the shielding effect of your vehicle. You're inside of a metal box. Do you think that your signal might have trouble getting through that metal box? And it will get through there, but will it experience some degradation, some shielding? Yeah. So what do you do about that? Well, you mount an antenna on the outside of your car and run that to your handheld radio. Or better yet, get a mobile radio, which has more power. SWR is standing wave ratio, and that is referring to that reflected power that comes back to you if your antenna is not properly tuned, that we talked about earlier. What device increases the low power output from a handheld transceiver? Should be obvious. It's a RF power amplifier. Your ham radio puts out RF, radio frequencies, and it's a power amplifier. Which type of modulation is most commonly used for VHF and UHF voice repeaters? We talked about this a lot, that a lot of times, and especially in the upper VHF, UHF frequencies, we're using FM. What is the approximate bandwidth of a VHF FM phone signal? So we've got choices here, we've got to decide. Now I've told you it's 25 and I am correct, but we got to give the answer to the test. And if you think about my answer, which is 25 kilohertz wide, it's going to be 12.5 kilohertz on each side of the signal. And there's only one answer that's anywhere even close to that, 10 to 15 kilohertz. So D, that's huge. That's really wide. A and B are really small amounts. So it's none of those. It was just up here on the board explaining how your signal goes. Oh, well, 25 is actually what it is. I don't know why they listed that. It could be anything, right? I can make it narrow band. You can make it whatever you want. They're saying these could be common amounts that you might have your radio set to. I'm telling you that most radios are operating here. But there's only one answer that's even reasonable out of these. That's incredibly wide. These are incredibly narrow. And so you're going to go with the 10 to 15 kilohertz wide. But it's just a unit of measurement. So what type of modulation is most commonly used for VHF packet radio transmissions? The answer is FM. There's nothing to know about this. It's just you memorize it. This is what it is. It uses FM. Which of the following can be used to enter the operating frequency on a modern transceiver? The answer is a keypad or VFO knob. Okay, a keypad obviously is the number pad on the front. You can just punch in the frequency. VFO stands for variable frequency oscillator. It's what allows you to tune in the signal. Your car stereo has a VFO. You've got memory buttons. Sometimes you can, even on your car stereo, punch in the frequency, or you just turn the knob, which is a VFO, and it just tunes through all the available frequencies within the capabilities of that radio. That's all that is. They want you to understand. The reason why this is important is because commercial radios don't typically have VFOs, because a commercial radio doesn't need to just tune to any frequency within a range. If it's the police, they have the 5 frequencies or however many that they bought from the FCC. They don't need to go anywhere else because they only have 5. They can't just pick a random frequency. That's against the law. They would be breaking the law. But as ham radio operators, we're not given frequencies. We're not given specific frequencies or channels. We get ranges, and we can operate anywhere in between. And that's why they want you to know that you have a VFO knob that's unique to amateur radio. What is the purpose of the squelch control on a transceiver? It mutes the receiver's output noise when no signal is being received. It's easier to demonstrate this than to really explain it, but I don't have a radio with me. But basically, there's noise, there's static. I mean, if you tune your radio now, your car radio, where there's no channel, you'll hear static. And so what squelch does is it silences your radio until it actually hears a signal. It makes it pleasant to listen to. If you wanted to scan through a set of frequencies and you told your radio, scan these frequencies and stop when you pick up a signal. But if you didn't have any squelch, it would stop immediately because it's going to pick up the signal of static. You adjust the squelch until the static's no longer heard, and then it starts scanning through and doesn't stop until hopefully until it picks up a valid signal. So that is the purpose of squelch.
So it's got a threshold of wattage that it's trying.
Well, it wouldn't be wattage, it would be a voltage that's actually inferred from the antenna. But yes, yep, there's always some form of background noise. And this just takes it up and says, this is the level that I don't receive anything below this amount, only things that are above.
So on my microphone, in what I will do that, I can set the different levels so that it won't pick up background noises, dogs barking, like even Zoom does this.
Yeah.
So it's all the same technology.
Yeah, it is basically an automatic squelch at that point because the computer can actually sit there and realize what's ambient. You know, we can hear the air conditioning in this room and it says, oh, we don't need that. But anything above that, it's probably somebody talking and I'll pick that up. Yep. There's another circuit and component within a ham radio called Vox, VOX. Vox is a voice-controlled transmitter, and it has a similar threshold that you set. And it says, anything below this, don't pick up, don't act on, and anything above this is what I want you to hear. And so if I had a Vox transmitter, I would be able to, as I'm talking to you now, it would key the radio and the microphone would be picking me up and I'd go over the air. And then as I stopped talking, it would shut the transmitter off. And as I started again, it would bring it up again. So that's a similar technology, except it's used for activating the transmitter. This is on the receiver. What term describes an amateur station that's transmitting and receiving on the same frequency? We've talked about this before. It's simplex. Yep, so if we're transmitting and receiving on the same frequency, it has to be simplex, because that's not simultaneous. Simultaneous communications are happening when I transmit and receive on different frequencies, because otherwise my transmitter would interfere with my own receiver. Because my receiver is listening on frequency A, and if I transmit on A, it picks itself up. It would go into an infinite loop. And that's why repeaters have to have a receive frequency and a transmit frequency. So this is just a little diagram. This is in your book. Its only purpose is just to show you how if you're on the same frequency, it's simplex communications. It's one person talking at a time. You transmit, then receive. It's not done simultaneously. But once you have different frequencies, you can transmit and receive at the same time. Why are simplex channels designated in the VHF and UHF band plans? So that stations within mutual communications range can communicate without tying up a repeater. So if I lived here in Milford, Okay, and I want to talk to Michelle. Yeah, we could talk on the repeater, but how many people can talk on the repeater really at the same time? We can get a bit of a group, but it gets congested. Well, why tie up the repeater if we could just talk direct? We'll just tune into a simplex frequency, we start talking, and now the repeater is available maybe for mobile stations that are far out and need it to help relay their communication. So it's just a way to make the repeater available for other people who actually need it. Oftentimes, you're going to find that the repeaters are not very busy, and nobody cares if you're on it. And that's fine. They'd like to hear the activity, but there is a purpose and a reason for that. One nice thing about it, though, is that repeater, let's say it has a 30-mile range. Everyone within a 30-mile radius can hear my conversation. But if I'm relatively close and you and I are talking direct on a non-repeater frequency and our signal maybe only goes out 5-mile radius, well, it becomes a lot more private because people within 5 miles are the only ones that can hear us, and they have to find us to begin with. Everybody knows the repeater frequency, but they don't know the random frequency that you and I decided to pick to talk on. So it affords some level of, you're never private, right? Anybody can hear it. Don't mistake that. But it does afford some level of privacy. Which of the following is required when making on-the-air test transmissions? So what does this mean? I'm testing, but what am I also doing? I'm transmitting on the air. What does the law say? The law says I have to identify the transmitting station. That's at the end of the transmission or every 10 minutes. So they just want, why is this there? Because they want you to understand that even if you just make a real quick key up, don't say anything, we're testing your power output. You hooked a meter up and you wanted to measure how much power. Oh, it was just for 5 seconds. You still have to identify your transmission. The fact that it's a test transmission doesn't mean anything. If it goes out over the air, it must be identified. What's the meaning of the procedural signal CQ? Calling any station. Why is that? Because somebody made it that. What's a good way to remember it? If I'm seeking you. How do people use this? I get on the HF frequencies. I find a frequency that's not in use. How do I know it's not in use? Because I listen and it's not in use. I can even ask, is the frequency in use? Nobody comes back to me. I know nobody's there. Then I start calling. CQ, CQ, CQ. This is K7DN calling CQ. CQ, CQ, CQ calling CQ. K7DN calling CQ. And if I don't hear any response, I repeat it again. People who are tuning through on their VFO, just going through the frequencies, will all of a sudden hear that and say, oh, I'd like to talk to that guy. Maybe because they want to talk to me, or maybe because they just want to talk to anybody, right? And I'm calling anybody out there. And then they would then say, K7DN, this is W8SJY. And then we would start talking. So that's what CQ means. That's how you use it. You typically do not call CQ on FM. There's not a legal thing. It's just convention. You just don't do it, but you could do it. There's nothing wrong with it. You typically then also would not go on a repeater and start calling CQ. People will laugh at you. But what you do is if I went on a repeater and I wanted to talk to whoever's out there, I would just say K7DN monitoring. Same difference. It lets people know, hey, K7DN's on the frequency, and if I want to talk to them, I'll respond back. Yeah. If they didn't quite catch your call sign, they might say station monitoring, this is W8SJY. And then I'd say, hey, W8SJY, this is Kilo 7 Delta November. Name here is Matthew, how are you? And then we would start talking. So. Sure. Again, you're probably, so the question was, if you're out driving in an area that you're not familiar with, could you call CQ and ask, if there's a good place to eat locally? Yes, you absolutely could. Again, you're probably not going to want to say CQ on FM. And if you're talking to somebody, trying to get somebody local, but you don't know who they are, you're going to be on that FM simplex calling frequency or the local repeater that you looked up ahead of time. And because you're on FM, you're not going to say CQ. You'll just say K7DN monitoring. FM simplex, you definitely can get away with calling CQ more. It's still, you're not supposed to, but again, it's not wrong. It's not illegal. No, it's just that they just decided that you don't do that. Yeah, it's just, yeah. Why is your salad fork smaller than your entree fork? Yeah, so it's, yeah, exactly. It's like, why is a salad fork, smaller than an entree fork? Did your mouth grow bigger as you were eating your meal? No, it's just they decided that the salad fork was to be smaller. Yeah.
And it kind of reminds me of that, like never use these words this way.
So which of the following is a guideline when choosing an operating frequency for calling CQ? The answer is D. Listen first to make sure nobody else is using the frequency. Ask if the frequency is in use, and make sure that you are in your assigned band. So are you allowed to transmit there? Are you listening? Is there nobody there? You can even ask. When you're on the HF frequencies, it is very common for you to only be able to hear one side of the conversation. We're talking about distant stations from around the world, and it's very reasonable that the person, there could even be somebody here in Ohio talking to somebody in England, and the person from here in Ohio, their signal bounces right over the top of you because it's going clear to England. You don't even hear it, but you can hear the guy in England because their signal's making it into Ohio. And so you'll only hear one side of the conversation, which means you could tune in when there's the guy in Ohio is talking who you can't hear. And then you're like, oh, there's nobody on this frequency. And then you start transmitting and find out that you're overriding the guy who's just, 50, 100 miles up the road. And then the guy in England will very rudely tell you that, yes, this frequency is in use, And so it's really good to listen and then even ask, because it's entirely possible you would only hear one half of that conversation.
Question from Zoom, where can we find all of these conventions that Matthew is talking about? Is there a guidebook?
Nope. Nope. So, in ham radio, they call your mentor your Elmer. Okay. And so it's best to find somebody who's experienced that can, talk to you on the air and teach you these things, because it's not law, so it's not written anywhere. Obviously, that one is, at least in the book, that suggests that you ask, although it doesn't really explain why. And that's what your Elmer would do, is explain why that's important. But find an Elmer. That's why I gave everybody my email. I'm not going to be very effective as an Elmer when you're really far away, but when you have just a general question, shoot me an email. I'll be glad to answer it and help however I can. But certainly finding somebody local is going to be really helpful by joining your local radio club. Yep, absolutely. Plus, join the ARRL. I don't know how much it costs per month, but you'll get that magazine, and it has a lot of information, a lot of articles about ham etiquette and how to build antennas and how to do all kinds of neat projects. So highly recommended. When I was 19, I got a lifetime membership to the ARRL, so it's already paid for itself. So I'm glad for that. But scraping together $875 at that time was rough. but it's been worth it. It's probably over 1,100 now for a lifetime. But anyway, it's a great organization. But the material, you get a really nice magazine every month. It's well worth it.
$49 a year.
Oh, is it? That doesn't sound right, but I guess it could be. Somebody said it's $49 a year. That to me sounds like how much the ARRL handbook costs, but okay, well, maybe it is $50 a year now. Yeah. So, okay. Which of the following is a use for the scanning function of an FM transceiver? The answer is to scan through a range of frequencies to check for activity. And so we know that we can transmit from 144 to 148. So, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to scan 144 to 148 because we know that not all of that is for FM signals. Well, we don't need to listen to those because if we only have an FM radio, then that doesn't do us any good to hear another type of signal because we can't understand it. And odds are we want to either listen for simplex frequencies or maybe repeaters. We're in an area where we don't know the repeaters, but we know where repeaters are located because we have that gentleman's agreement band plan. And so we can limit our range there. And one of the differences, what's the difference between that $30 Chinese radio or even the $100 Chinese radio and one of those much more expensive, nicer Japanese radios? Some of those nicer Japanese radios will have a color digital display. And when you set a frequency range, it won't just sit there and scan through it. It will actually show you a graphical interface with signal spikes where all these are. Because when you scan through, it's slow. It takes time to go through there. This immediately starts showing you all these spikes of activity. Plus, the problem is when you scan through, let's say it takes a minute to scan from one range to the other. Well, in that minute, somebody could stop talking and you scan right through it and miss it. But that graphical display is going to be showing it in real time where everybody is. So that's why it costs $300 or $400 for a nicer radio. Do you need that? Of course not. But can you now understand why it costs more? Yeah, it's got better features. So also the very expensive radios are usually going to be FM and digital. So you'll have digital communications. How should you respond to a station calling CQ? You transmit the other call sign followed by your call sign. Okay, so if I'm the one calling CQ, I say CQ, this is K7DN. And then somebody responding back to me would say K7DN, this is W8SJY. Okay, it's really no different than when you pick up the telephone. Usually, if I'm going to call somebody, I would say, "Hi, Michelle, it's Matthew." I wouldn't just start talking. Usually, that's weird. And so, yeah, it's basically just the same ways that you would talk to somebody on the telephone. You say their name and then who you are. What is an appropriate way to call another station on a repeater if you know the other station's call sign? Say the station's call sign, then identify with your call sign. Yep. Basically, if you broke it down into just names, Hi, Leah, it's Matthew. Or Leah, it's Matthew. Are you there? Basically, except I would say W8SJY K7DN. So I say who I'm calling and who I am. Also, if the conversation end there, she didn't respond, what was the very last transmission I made? My call sign. I don't need to identify again. I've already said it. So, because she might not respond, and then I'm going to go to a different frequency. Yeah. What should you do if another operator reports that your station's 2-meter signals were strong just a moment ago, but now they're weak or distorted? The answer is try moving a few feet or changing the direction of your antenna if possible, as reflections may be causing multipath distortion. So what this is talking about is your signal, especially at 2 meters, which has a small wavelength. Remember, higher the frequency, the smaller the wavelength. And your signal is going to start bouncing off of things. It is possible that you can have something called multipath. And that is, if I'm transmitting here, the signal is going to arrive to you directly, but my voice is actually bouncing off of that wall and arriving to you as well. If, depending on that reflection, like if there was a mirror on the wall and I shined a laser, I could move just right so that laser would hit you. And if I move just a few feet, it will bounce, away. If my direct signal to you and this multiple path signal arrive together, they cancel each other out, cause interference. And because we have a small wavelength, the amount of distance it takes to change that is very small as well, just a few feet. So if I have multipath here, I could be in my house talking to my radio and it's not coming in very clearly, and I just step to the side a couple feet, it could be all the difference in the world.